With the historic Normandy landing successfully accomplished, the Allies took stock of their situation. On June 7th, D-Day +1, General Eisenhower and Admiral Ramsey, his naval commander-in-chief, inspected the landing beaches with an eye to the problem of landing the large additional forces needed for the big drive against Hitler's armies.
It was necessary to provide a means for sheltering beach supply from the effect of storms. To solve this problem, we undertook to construct artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. One type of protected anchorage, named Mulberry, was practically a complete harbor. The principal construction unit in the Mulberry was an enormous concrete ship called a Phoenix, box-like in shape, and so heavily constructed that when numbers of them were sunk end to end along a strip of the coast, they would probably provide solid protection against almost any wave action. Elaborate auxiliary equipment to facilitate unloading and all types of gear required in the operation of a modern port were planned for and provided. The British and American sectors each had one of the Mulberry ports. Here, ships and landing craft could continue to unload in any except the most vicious weather. We had simultaneously to build up on the beaches the reserves in troops, ammunition, and supplies that would enable us within a reasonable time to initiate deep offensives with the certainty that these could be sustained through an extended period of decisive action.
As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use a miraculously short time after the men started work. The results of their efficiency were readily felt, especially by the enemy. Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces was the host for a tour of inspection of the area by several unexpected visitors from Washington.
I arranged to take General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, and a group from their respective staffs into the beachhead during the day of June 12th. Their presence, as they roamed around the areas with every indication of keen satisfaction, was heartening to the troops. The importance of such visits by the High Command can scarcely be overestimated in terms of their value to soldiers' morale. On that same day, June 12, 1944, the first flying bomb, known as V-1, reached London. The V-1 was a small, pilotless airplane which flew at high speed on a predetermined course and terminated its flight by means of settings in its mechanism. It contained a large amount of explosive which detonated upon contact, and the blast effect was terrific. The depressing effect of the bombs was not confined to the civilian population. Soldiers at the front began again to worry about friends and loved ones at home, and many American soldiers asked me whether I could give them any news about particular towns in southern England. The effect of the new weapons was very noticeable upon morale.
All anti-aircraft crews in the area tried to hit them in flight with some success. Every means at hand was used to try to explode them before they landed. In Germany, construction was being rushed on newer, more devastating weapons. In the final stages of its experimental phase, the V-2 rocket bomb was being readied for use against England. In early tests, many V-2s turned out to be failures. But after 2 years of experimentation, the rockets were performing well enough for leading German engineers to persuade Hitler that their use in large numbers against England would achieve wholesale destruction. The first non-experimental launching was set for late summer.
On June 19th, the hurricane struck us. It stopped for a period of 4 days nearly all landing activity on the beaches and therefore interfered seriously with every operation. During that time, sea communications between the United Kingdom and the continent were completely interrupted. On the day of the storm's ending, I counted more than 300 wrecked vessels above small boat size, some so badly damaged they could not be salvaged. There was no sight in the war that so impressed me with the industrial might of America as the wreckage on the landing beaches. To any other nation, the disaster would have been almost decisive. But so great was America's productive capacity that the great storm occasioned little more than a ripple in the development of our buildup. General Bradley had predicted that the capture of Cherbourg was going to be a rather nasty job and counted on speed and boldness as much as upon the strength of his assaulting forces to gain an early decision in that area. His estimate was 10 days if we are lucky, 30 if we are not.
The capture of Cherbourg, a major port, was a matter of immediate importance. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job expected stiff resistance from the defending Nazi garrison. Before our big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, American Cub planes again proved invaluable in spotting enemy strongpoints. Once their positions were spotted, our attack got going without delay.
Fire!
Cherbourg itself was strongly defended, but by June 25th, the first American troops forced their way into the city after a vicious battle and paved the way for the final capture. But first, the GIs had a last remnant of the Nazi garrison to silence. GIs had to finish them off, one by one. Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. The area yielded some 39,000 Nazi prisoners, most of whom had fought stubbornly until confronted by American infantry patrols. These Nazis seemed surprised indeed to find themselves in Allied hands, and especially in such a short time. Their grandiose dreams of victory had never ended in such a humiliating spectacle. After several days, there were few reminders of the Nazi occupation. To the citizens of Cherbourg, life began again. The Nazis, in their customary fashion, had succeeded in pretty thoroughly wrecking Cherbourg. But the Allies now controlled a major port, which would enable them to deliver large quantities of supplies to the troops much more quickly. General Eisenhower was greatly pleased with the performance of the troops under Generals Bradley and Lieutenant Joe Collins on the western flank in the Battle of the Beachhead. In their first real test on French soil, they had come through in fine style.
Montgomery's tactical handling of the British and Canadians on the eastward flank involved the kind of work in which he excelled. The morale of his forces remained high, in spite of frustrations and losses that could easily have shaken troops under a commander in whom they did not place their implicit trust. Caen did not fall to our initial rush as we had hoped, but the battling in that area reached a sustained and intensive pitch. Rommel defended tenaciously.
For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assaults. After a month of steady bombing and shelling, Caen finally was taken by Montgomery's men on July 9th. The community, or what was left of it, was liberated at last, and the townsfolk no longer moved about in the shadow of the Nazi conqueror. The younger inhabitants, who had been children when the Nazis swept through France in 1940, were especially happy to be liberated. After the capture of Caen by the British, the advance of Allied forces on all fronts was slowed down.
The battle for position and of building up reserves progressed at times with disappointing slowness. There always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses and are meanwhile hearing their commanders criticized.
To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matters of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant that they would have to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Most effective morale builder for many GIs was a chance to renew their spiritual lives. To many GIs who had their faith to comfort them, even the prospect of death seemed easier to bear. Of course, there were moments which were not grim. In many of the liberated French towns and villages, the inhabitants were anxious to demonstrate their appreciation of deliverance from their Nazi conquerors. Meanwhile, a concentrated Allied attack was already overdue. The key point on the Allied offensive was the town of Saint-Lô, from which Allied commanders planned to break out in spite of strong enemy counteraction. The capture of Saint-Lô was a major step in breaking through the heavy layer of Nazi resistance.
The weather, which had been bad, grew abominably worse, and for the following week, all of us went through a period of agonizing tenseness. We had to draw plans to take advantage of the first favorable break in the weather. Finally, on July 25th, 7 weeks after D-Day, the attack was launched from the approximate line we had expected to hold on D+5, stretching from Caen through Caumont to Saint-Lô.
As expected, the Allies had a tough job on their hands.
progress on the first day was slow, but it was always slow going in the early phases of such an attack.
With the Germans fighting desperately to contain them, Bradley's forces continued their punishing attack.
In the following week, he slashed his way downward to the base of the peninsula. With a clean and decisive breakout achieved, Bradley's immediate problem became that of inflicting on the enemy the greatest possible destruction.
The Allies drove almost due south through Avranches. The First Army then turned eastward to hit the Germans' flank, but the enemy contested this action.
His attacks, which were thrown in at the town of Mortain, just east of Avranches, began on August 7th.
The weight of the Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdeval, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 somewhat battered tank divisions into the battle, the Nazis continued their counteroffensive for 3 days. Their gains were tiny, a matter of only a few miles, but they fanatically carried on their attack in spite of equally determined opposition. They used every available weapon in their sustained attack on our tanks and troops. They matched us weapon for weapon.
Had the German tanks and infantry succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the predicament of all Allied troops beyond that point would have been serious. There were many points of similarity between this situation and the one that developed some 4 months later in the Ardennes, which resulted in the Battle of the Bulge. With a clean and decisive breakout achieved, Bradley's immediate problem became that of inflicting on the enemy the greatest possible destruction. The enemy concentrated the bulk of his available armor at Mortain and continued his obstinate attack until August 12th.
If the Germans succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the Allied position beyond that area would be grave.
The air cooperation of the U.S. 9th Air Force and the RAF against the enemy attack was extraordinarily effective. The Royal Air Force had a large number of Typhoons equipped with rocket-firing devices. These kept up a sustained assault against the enemy's forces that was of great help to the defending infantry.
Successfully withstanding the brunt of the Nazi attack, the Allies now moved to encircle the forward Nazi units. This maneuver was to be accomplished by a double thrust, by the Canadian First Army toward Falaise and by the U.S. Third Army toward Argentan. Patton's Third Army split into 2 major groups, one section driving straight eastward from Laval and the other swinging around the Nazis' flank and driving north into the German position at Argentan.
By the night of August 13th, the U.S. 5th Armored Division was in the outskirts of Argentan. The French 2nd Armored Division was nearby, and the U.S. 79th and 90th Divisions were in close support.
Caught in the giant pincers between Falaise and Argentan, the Germans suffered staggering casualties. Thousands killed and wounded in only a few days' fighting.
In the aggregate, considerable numbers of Germans succeeded in getting away. Their escape, however, meant an almost complete abandonment of their heavy supply and was accomplished only by terrific sacrifices.
Meanwhile, the Canadian drive into the Germans' flank from the north at Falaise met determined Nazi resistance. By driving south through Falaise, the Canadians planned to join forces with the Americans near Argentan and thus completely encircle the forward Nazi attacking units. If this operation was successful, the roads across France would be open to Allied use, and nothing could stop an all-out Allied chase of the disorganized enemy to the banks of the Rhine. The battle on the Germans' northern flank was one of the most concentrated actions in the campaign on the continent. Against desperate resistance, the Canadian First Army troops hit the enemy in a direct frontal assault.
The Canadians threw in fierce and sustained attacks, but it was not until August 16th that Falaise was finally captured.
3 days later, near the little town of Chamois, the pincers closed as the Canadian Army, which took Falaise, met the Americans who seized Argentan, and a large Nazi force was effectively trapped. Many of the Nazi prisoners were disarmed and searched by French patriots who volunteered eagerly for the job. Though a considerable number of German troops escaped eastward toward the River Seine, more than 100,000 Nazi soldiers were caught within the circle and taken prisoner by the Allies.
8 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions were captured almost in their entirety.
For the Germans, the encirclement of thousands of their crack troops was supplemented by the loss of great quantities of invaluable materiel, which they could not immediately replace.
The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. Roads, highways, and fields were so choked with destroyed equipment and with dead men and animals that passage through the area was extremely difficult.
The Battle of the Falaise Pocket ended according to plan.
While the bulk of Bradley's forces was engaged in this great battle, General Middleton's 8th Corps turned back to the westward to overrun the Brittany Peninsula. He made a rapid advance and invested Saint-Malo, the small port on the north coast. The garrison resisted fanatically, but Middleton was able, with cooperating air and naval forces, to bring to bear enough power to reduce it by August 14th, although remnants of the garrison held out for 3 more days.
For weeks, the 8th Corps assaulted the Nazi defenses on the Brittany Peninsula before the enemy capitulated. The German garrison, what was left of it, surrendered after an exhausting siege. Some of the defenders had obviously fortified themselves with alcohol during the drawn-out battle and were most uncooperative about answering questions put to them by their captors. The goal of every Allied soldier, from private to general, who set foot on the soil of France in the summer of 1944, was Paris. For General Jacques Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Division, which had fought brilliantly in the desert campaign in Africa against Rommel, this goal had a special meaning. The moment when the French capital would finally be freed drew excitingly close as the Allies rolled victoriously through the crowded streets of newly liberated French towns. This was the momentous day the townsfolk had dreamed about for 4 long years. For in June 1940, with the arrival of the Nazi troops, the gay city that was Paris had changed into a somber, spiritless German garrison town, which the Nazis planned to turn into a playground for the military. Everywhere there were German uniforms. The conquering Nazi soldiers who had marched into Paris in June were replaced by special occupation troops. And always there was a steady flow of German fighting men back from the fronts for liberty. The City of Light became a city of sorrow under the shadow of the swastika. From the day they occupied it, the Nazis fell to work on transforming the face of the city. Evidences of this metamorphosis on every side reminded doleful Parisians that their city was no longer theirs. As expected, the Nazis with their Gestapo ruled Paris with an iron hand. With the German military in complete control, the city became an armed camp and functioned in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust under the strict surveillance of the ubiquitous Nazi soldiery. Even traditional French ceremonies were conducted under the watchful eye of the conquerors. However, Parisians did succeed in keeping the torch burning at the tomb of their unknown soldier of World War I throughout the Nazi occupation. But the Nazi occupation forces did not supervise everything that went on in Paris and the surrounding country. From the outside world came the voices of freedom. Voices like General de Gaulle, urging his countrymen to remain firm in their trust in the final victory for France and its people. Loyal Frenchmen did not merely mark time during the occupation. Soon after the Germans imposed their rule, resistance groups sprang up all over the country. Seizure of ammunition had a high priority on the list of resistance activities aimed at undermining the Nazis at every opportunity. Demolition of rail lines had a crippling effect on Nazi movements of troops and equipment. A true picture of what was actually happening in France and in the free world outside was presented in the pages of resistance newspapers, published secretly and distributed to Frenchmen eager for a few words of hope. Hundreds of underground newspapers were published during the occupation under overwhelming handicaps. The Allies sometimes managed to drop supplies to those groups who were among the most active in the resistance. The Maquis, whose members hid in the hills to avoid being forced into Nazi labor gangs. With this badly needed equipment, the Maquisards operated as guerrillas and sometimes killed several hundred Nazi soldiers in surprise attacks. After D-Day on the Normandy beaches, the various Maquis groups were organized into the FFI, French Forces of the Interior, to assist Allied troops in the destruction of the enemy. In mid-August, with Allied armies only a few kilometers from Paris, the resistance opposition to the Nazis flared into open insurrection. The long-planned revolt began to take shape. All Parisians knew the Allies were not far off, and their mounting hate toward their Nazi rulers at last came fully out into the open. The National Resistance Council had planned thoroughly for the day of vengeance. They concluded their preparations coolly and waited for the right moment to strike. Finally, on August 19th, the resistance opened fire. Once started, the insurrection quickly gained momentum. The revolt was successful in one sense. Numbers of the enemy were killed, and German administrators in key civil posts were put to rout. The German grip on Paris was effectively loosened by the FFI. But many felt that the revolt was premature. It soon became apparent that the Parisians were not quite strong enough to win back their city completely without aid.
When the Free French forces inside Paris staged their uprising, it was necessary to move rapidly to their support. Information indicated that no great battle would take place, and it was believed that the entry of one or two Allied divisions would accomplish the liberation of the city. For the honor of first entry, General Leclerc's French 2nd Division was selected. It was a satisfying climax to an odyssey which, in its entire length, carried all the way from Central Africa to Berchtesgaden in Germany.
General Leclerc's men entered Paris on August 24th, and immediately restored the city officially to French authority. For 50 months, Parisians had waited for this moment, when they could again breathe the air of freedom so long denied them. Overnight, Paris was once again gay and happy. The people's unshakable trust in the return of a free France had proved sound. Liberty, equality, fraternity was again the standard. But the French soldiers still had the enemy to contend with. General Leclerc's tank crews and American Shermans used their experience gained at Le Mans and Alençon to good advantage. Paris again became a battleground. Many of its most fashionable avenues were under constant enemy sniper fire. To assist the French 2nd Division, elements of the American 4th Division were sent in, and American and French soldiers fought side by side in what was inevitably an unplanned action. The skirmish in the Paris area continued throughout the greater part of 2 days. Allied tanks proved invaluable as street fighting weapons. With the last remnants of the Nazi defenders dead or captured, the Germans surrendered to the Allies on August 25th. The Nazi soldiers who had strutted around Paris with such a show of invincibility presented a far different picture. They fully realized the hate Parisians had grown to have toward them, and seemed to anticipate far from gentle treatment now that the positions were reversed. The city was formally surrendered to the Allies by General Dietrich von Holtitz as commander of the Nazi garrison, which had dwindled to 12,000 men.
Immediately after the capture of Paris, I notified General de Gaulle that I hoped he would quickly enter the capital. I desired that he, as the symbol of French resistance, should make an entrance before I had to go in or through it. The victory celebration was quickly thrown into disorder by sudden bursts of machine gun and rifle fire. The crowds near the Cathedral of Notre Dame were directly in the line of fire of the rooftop snipers, who were clearly Vichy militiamen and French collaborationists. The shooting spread. Soon they were shooting all over central Paris. When any of this group of snipers were caught, they fared far worse at the hands of the Parisians than had the Germans captured during the earlier fighting. On the Saturday following the capture of Paris, I determined to make a formal call upon General de Gaulle. We entered Paris quietly and secretly, as we supposed, on Sunday, August 27th. Word apparently got out that Bradley and I were in town, and we were surrounded by a crowd of enthusiastic citizens. The exuberant greetings were a bit embarrassing, and we made our way as quickly as possible to one of the exit gates. I promised de Gaulle that 2 of our divisions would march to the front through the main avenues of the city. I declined personally to be present at this formation, but told him that General Bradley would come back to the city and stand the review to symbolize Allied unity. Because this ceremonial march coincided exactly with the local battle plan, It became possibly the only instance in history of troops marching in parade through the capital of a great country to participate in pitched battle on the same day. The liberation of Paris had a great impact on people everywhere. From the beginning of the Southern invasion, all battlefronts in France really became one, and all plans, both tactical and logistical, were devised upon the assumption that soon the whole would constitute one continuous order of battle.
The plan called for an Allied landing on the Mediterranean French coast between Toulon and Cannes. The whole coastal area, extending from the beaches inland for about 150 miles, was thoroughly softened up for the assault troops. For 3.5 months preceding the invasion date, 5,000 Allied planes dropped some 12,500 tons of bombs on southern France. Early on the morning of August 15, 1944, the mounting air bombardment was supplemented by strong naval fire against the beaches. Soon after dawn on the same morning, the invasion troops prepared for the trip to shore. There was as yet no hint of enemy resistance. Spearheaded by 3 American divisions, supplemented by French units, the U.S. 7th Army made the assault. The troops, many of them veterans of the North African and Italian campaigns, stormed ashore at 8 a.m. and met very light opposition. The landing was executed exactly as planned. The enemy was caught by surprise. The American and French assault units, once ashore, were opposed by only 2 German divisions, spread along the coast, and 8 more farther inland. 7th Army troops won a 15-mile-wide beachhead with comparative ease, and the operation was considered an overwhelming success by Allied field commanders. With the beachhead securely ours, the drive inland was begun without delay. The course of the advance was to be up the valley of the Rhone River. The troops started their drive toward the valley against stiffening resistance. The assault forces were helped materially by members of the French underground, as well as by French villagers encountered along the path of the advance. During the first few days of the campaign, the 7th Army and the Maquis captured more than 10,000 Nazi troops. Throughout the Allied drive in southern France, the Maquis played an especially active and extremely valuable part. The southern France invasion force was to fight its way up the Rhone Valley and then swing eastward into Germany. Having overcome the Nazi defenders along the coast, the 7th Army pushed up the valley on the heels of the main body of German forces racing north toward the German frontier. The pursuit was speeded up in an attempt to trap the fleeing Nazis. The Air Force pounded the exposed German columns steadily. At intervals, the Allied chase was slowed down as the 7th Army troops were called upon to reduce a pocket of Nazi resistance. The GIs went about the job quickly and efficiently. During the first 2 weeks of the campaign in southern France, thousands of Nazis were killed and 50,000 captured. After 10 days of fighting, the Allied force reached the Rhone River itself at Montélimar, 100 miles from the landing beaches. Here, a last-ditch Nazi stand was quickly beaten down. The advancing Americans trapped one Nazi panzer division and elements of 2 other German divisions. The Germans lost great quantities of materiel in their unsuccessful defense at Montélimar, and additional thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the brief but savage battle. In town after town in their victorious drive up the Rhone Valley, the GIs were greeted with enthusiasm by the overjoyed French townspeople. On September 11th, junction was made between the southern France assault force and American units which had entered France from the Atlantic coast. In the Dijon area, the U.S. 7th and 3rd Army troops made contact, and western France was sealed off. For the final push to the German frontier, the Allies presented a single powerful battle line. Sparking the drive to the east was Patton's 3rd Army.
Patton realized that through speed and determination, each successive advantage is more easily and economically gained than the previous one. Relentless and speedy pursuit is the most profitable action in war.
But the Germans did not simply fall back. The Nazis showed every intention of fighting savagely for every mile of eastern France still in their hands. They used all available mobile equipment in their strong effort to stem the Allied advance along the whole battle line. In a concerted attempt to stabilize their defense, the Nazis fought stubbornly, fully aware that if this stand were unsuccessful, the Allies would, before long, penetrate into Germany itself. In their determined defense, they used their newest, most improved weapons. The Allies hammered continuously at the Nazi line, which had stiffened abruptly. The Allied attack was not quite strong enough. Though handicapped by lengthening supply lines, the Allies kept up their attack on all sections of the front in an all-out drive toward the German frontier. The battle continued for weeks during the early autumn. Elements of Patton's 3rd Army advanced the Allied position a little closer to the German Siegfried Line as they crossed the Meuse River.
We were certain that by continuing an unremitting offensive, we would, in spite of hardship and privation, gain additional advantages over the enemy. Specifically, we were convinced that this policy would result in shortening the war, and therefore in the saving of thousands of Allied lives. Consequently, the fall period was to become a memorable one because of a series of bitterly contested battles, usually conducted under the most trying conditions of weather and terrain. Fighting throughout the front, from Switzerland to the mouth of the Rhine, descended during the late fall months to the dirtiest kind of infantry slugging. Advances were slow and laborious. Gains were ordinarily measured in terms of yards rather than miles. Operations became mainly a matter of endurance, stamina, and courage. Because of depletion of their infantry strength, divisions quickly exhausted themselves in action. Our offensive strength fell off markedly. During the 3 months beginning September 1st, I spent a great portion of my time in travel. I visited commanders in their own headquarters, kept personal touch with problems as they arose, and above all, gained a feel of the troops.
All along the front, Allied planes kept up the attack on Nazi defensive positions. American troops advanced yard by yard in the drive to push the enemy back within his own borders.
The French First Army led the attack on the Belfort Gap and breached it within a week. Its leading troops quickly reached the Rhine. This turned the flank of the German position in the Vosges Mountains and forced a general withdrawal. We were disposed along a line which, beginning in the north on the banks of the Rhine, stretched 500 miles southward to the border of Switzerland. All our divisions were short in infantry replacements, and in total numerical strength of ground forces, the Germans still had a marked advantage. We could, on the average, deploy less than 1 division to each 10 miles of front. By October 1st, our aggregate strength on the continent was 54 divisions. As a result of the junction with Patch's 7th Army, a considerable number of Germans were trapped in southwestern France. These began to give themselves up by driblets, except in one instance when 20,000 Germans surrendered in a single body.
At Beaugency on September 17th, Nazi General Erich Elster had surrendered 20,000 German troops under his command, marking the end of the Nazi Army of Occupation in southern France. The mass surrender was made without the loss of a single Allied soldier's life. In the north, the Allies decided to drop 3 parachute divisions into German-held Holland in an operation ultimately designed to turn the Nazis' northern flank. The British 1st Airborne Division was to land farthest north, near Arnhem, while the Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were dropping a bit farther south. The operation was regarded as a large gamble, but if the Nazi bridges across the Rhine in the north could be seized, the war might be shortened materially. The drops were executed as planned. The first landings by the main airborne forces were made on September 17th and continued for several days following. Initial losses were slight, but there were some. In 2 weeks, more than 20,000 airborne troops had dropped into Holland. Over 13,000 more landed in gliders, which had been towed across the English Channel.
The attack began well, and unquestionably would have been successful, except for the intervention of bad weather. This prevented the adequate reinforcement of the northern spearhead, and resulted finally in the decimation of the British Airborne Division, and only a partial success in the entire operation.
But the Allied airborne troops in Holland accomplished one important task. Of the bridges to be seized, one of the most vital was the Nijmegen Bridge over the Waal, a branch of the Rhine. British and American troops surprised the Nazi force guarding the bridge and captured the valuable prize before the defenders had a chance to set off the demolitions already prepared. Allied ground forces moved safely across and continued the attack.
During the fall months, there was, as originally planned, much to be done operationally. In the north, besides capturing the approaches to Antwerp, it was desirable to make progress toward closing the Rhine, because it was from this region that our heaviest attacks would be launched in the crossing of that river. Winter conditions were now approaching, and Montgomery's advances were made over difficult country. Because of the extended front held by Montgomery's 21st Army Group, it was impossible at the moment to launch further strong offensives in that area.
To the south of the British forces, the Americans also ran into trouble.
The American First Army got involved in the Hurtgen Forest, the scene of one of the most bitterly contested battles of the entire campaign. The enemy had all the advantages of strong defensive country. The weather was abominable, and the German garrison was particularly stubborn.
All along the front in the Aachen sector, as winter drew near, the fighting continued heavy. But in the Hurtgen Forest, the battle was especially tough.
After the battle, whenever veterans of the American 4th, 9th, and 28th Divisions referred to hard fighting, they did so in terms of comparison with the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, which they placed at the top of the list. Yankee doggedness had finally won.
By mid-December, the Allies had penetrated the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line at several points. American troops were crossing the German frontier in preparation for the final phase of the war in Europe.